Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone in our audience, wherever you might be in the world. I am Doug Silliman, the president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion on U.S. efforts to arrange a grand bargain for normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel and all the various topics that entails. Let me introduce our special guest for today. He is Tom Friedman, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, journalist, commentator for the New York Times, periodic or frequent interviewer of presidents, prime ministers, and world leaders, and an inveterate identifier of global trends and important issues happening around the world. Tom, it's a pleasure to have you with us, and thank you for joining us today.
Doug, it's my pleasure.
Moderating our conversation is AGSIW's own senior resident scholar, Hussein Ibish. And Hussein, I don't want to take any more time out of this conversation, and I'm going to hand you the microphone and let the two of you have a good talk.
Thank you very much, Doug, and thanks to everybody for joining us. We've got a great audience out there. I'm really impressed by the size and quality of the people who are joining us. So do please feel free, not maybe right away, but as the conversation begins to unfold, to send in comments and questions via the Q&A function, and I'll do my best to bring in as many of them as possible. Tom, let me start out by thanking you so much for joining us today. You're very gracious with your time, and I really appreciate it. What we want to talk about, obviously, is the substance of your July 27 opinion column in the New York Times. Biden is weighing a big Middle East deal, in which you lay out some ideas that are floating around very high levels in all three capitals. And then also you elaborated on this already in an interview with the New Yorker, which is very, very interesting. And I recommend that as well. If our readers haven't seen the New Yorker piece, they should read it too, because you go into more detail and obviously gave you more space to, bring out the nuances of your thinking. So to start with, let's look at, rather than looking at the terms and conditions that are being discussed, let's look at how it is you came to learn about this, because I actually think that's the most, it's sort of a fundamental basis. I've heard bits and pieces of some of this before. Certainly, we knew that there was a dialogue, direct and indirect, between Saudis and Israelis about what kind of terms might be possible in the past 6 to 8 months, whatever it's been. But I was really surprised by the scope and specificity and how advanced you think these conversations are, especially in the White House. I was taken aback by your column. So can you tell me a little bit about how you came to learn of this before we get into what's being discussed?
Well, Hussein, first of all, thanks. It's always a treat being in dialogue with you. As readers should know, we often are, not on screen. We try to, while respecting just certain ground rules in which I learned some things, try to give you the full context. I had been invited by the president to come in and kind of talk about the Middle East about a month ago. And the day of the actual meeting happened to turn out, because it was made, again, weeks in advance, an hour after President Herzog of Israel left the White House. Now that became important, Hussein, because what had happened was, it was a Tuesday, I believe it was July 18th. On Monday, I was at DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, for a long an interview I had set up a long time ago. And I was so concerned about not missing it, because it was just with a really important technologist, that I got there early, and I was sitting on a bench outside the building. And my phone blew up at about, well, my meeting was at 3, so it blew up at about quarter to three, actually with a call from Yohanan Plessner, who runs the Israel Democracy Institute, essentially saying that the Biden administration had just thrown Israel's democracy movement under the bus. I said, what are you talking about? And he said that Bibi had just given an interview and said that Biden had called him, invited him to the White House, and that Bibi told Biden that, we're just going to do this little reform thing of the Constitution. Once we get that done, everything out of the way. And Biden was totally cool. And Bibi, even just to make the point, issued a picture of himself speaking to Biden on the phone, smiling from cheek to cheek. And I saw that, and I just said, what in the world is going on here? And I fired off a email to someone in the administration as a reporter columnist saying WTF, basically. Then I went into my meeting at DARPA, but when I came out 2.5 hours later, I realized that, and they realized that Bibi had done a complete number on them, that he had rushed this out, put his own spin on the meeting before the White House even had gotten around to issuing their readout. And again, one of the asymmetries in this thing is, I always try to remind Israelis that Joe Biden's dealing with the whole world. I mean, you may think that's all he's thinking about is this, but he's not. So they realized that what Netanyahu had done. They clarified it. They said, no, the president didn't invite him to the White House. They said, let's have a meeting sometime in September. And he repeated his views that Israel should not, just jump into this without a consensus. So it happened. My interview was with the president the next day, and then he, in much stronger terms, and in his own voice, reiterated that don't do this without even the semblance of a consensus. The rest of the meeting was off the record, but suffice it to say that the conversation drifted toward the Saudi-Israel deal.
Yeah.
Did
you bring it up, or did he bring it up?
I'm not going to get into that, but
okay.
But it wasn't me. And we just started talking about the basic contours, but I will tell you, Hussein, quite honestly, I was so focused on, because this was the day before the Israeli vote. So I was so focused on getting that into the newspaper that I kind of was not, the Saudi stuff was just sort of there, and then we went on to other things. So I went back to the office when I was done, and I wrote up the story that President of the United States, urges Netanyahu, don't do this without a consensus. And for the first time, and I thought very importantly, had some nice things to say about the democracy movement in Israel. One of the things that I've spoken about to other people, and I said in the New Yorker, there's a huge asymmetry in this story, and the asymmetry is that Israel is this democracy defense movement is, whatever you think about other things Israel is doing, and we can talk about all of them, and the West Bank and the like, is one of the most remarkable manifestations of democracy defense ever in the world. 30 weeks in a row of the equivalent of 2 to 3 million Americans coming out on the mall every week. And one of the asymmetries in the story, Hussein, is that no one in America, in terms of the Israeli system, is speaking for these people.
Right.
So the embassy won't defend them or praise them. Herzog really didn't when he spoke, specifically. And AIPAC would never come out in favor of them. So they really have they have no representation. They're completely sort of voiceless. And so I've tried to use my column as best I can and to get across the message and the importance of this. And so that column came out. Of course, it had no effect, and Bibi went ahead and rammed this thing through. So a couple of days later, I started to reflect again on the other half of our conversation. And I began doing some reporting and made some phone calls. and found that Jake Sullivan and Brett McGurk were about to leave for Saudi Arabia to pursue this idea. And I will say that the impression I'd left the White House with, which I have said, is that the meeting with President Biden was that he was still struggling with this idea. Go ahead or not go ahead. He was clearly still struggling. And then lo and behold, I found out that Jake and Brett were going. So then my reporting kicked in, and I was able to ascertain a few more details about this agreement, which, as you said, Hussein, has been in the air for a while now. I was in Riyadh, I don't know, 6 weeks ago. I talked about it with officials there, and but it never seemed to have quite cohered. But it was in the air. So I decided to write about it. But again, quite honestly, my focus was, and I framed the column this way, to say it was actually addressed to the Israel's democracy defenders who had just gotten their brains beaten in the Knesset. Yeah. And my theme was, hey, you may have just been crushed in this vote, but help may be on the way, because this deal seems to have it advanced farther than I realized, and evidence was that after being in the White House a week ago and feeling the president was struggling with it, they decided to go a whole nother step and send Jake Sullivan back to determine to ascertain it, what was possible. That's when I zeroed in on, for me, which was a twofer, the most important point, which is, and I'm slightly embarrassed. I can't tell you what exactly Saudi Arabia is going to give us, or we're going to give Saudi Arabia, and I didn't focus on it particularly, and it's just never been clear to me. So the macro deal, even, I don't even know if I will support it. When it comes out, we'll all just have to figure it out. But the one thing I wanted to make very clear to everyone was the terms that Saudi Arabia would set to normalize relations with Israel are vitally important strategic interests for the United States and for Israel, and for Saudi Arabia and for the whole Arab world. That this is a one-time sale, you know what I mean? And the price has to be very high. The price has to be very high for the deal to be in any way sustainable. Look at what I just read a poll this morning who's saying that the number of people in the Gulf supporting the Abraham Accords has fallen from like 40-50% to 25-27%.
That's right.
So that was really remarkable to me. So this wouldn't be sustainable without that. But I confess, and I don't have to confess, it's in the column. My goal is to blow up the current Israeli coalition and the worst, most extreme government in Israel's history. And the point I tried to make was, if you, Saudi Arabia, MBS, demand that, I will judge the quality of this price that you demand from Israel if it blows up the coalition. If it doesn't blow up the coalition, it's worthless. And so I threw out some ideas. They're literally off the top of my head. I mean, I could have said, hey, I have a lot of interest in this. You must insist that Israel sign up for the Arab Peace Initiative. Which, as you know, I know a lot about, but I didn't want to make it a bridge too far where people say, well, that's ridiculous, it'll never happen. So I looked for a set of things. But my point, I said this the other day, that it's ironic. There are two giant ironies here, Hussein. I'll point this out and then I'll stop.
No, go ahead.
One is that as I said of MBS, you may not be interested in Jewish history, but Jewish history is interested in you, because the terms that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia sets here could determine or not determine whether Israel has any hope of remaining a democratic and Jewish state. If he insists on the measurable, verifiable, and meaningful terms that will revive and advance a two-state solution, then that is something I would support and will obviously catalyze a whole set of changes in Israeli politics. And I think revive some chance, depending on what Palestinians do, for this moribund peace process to get revived again. The other irony, though, here, Hussein, and as a Washingtonian, you'll appreciate, Bibi Netanyahu has been prime minister now 16 years. He has basically spent those 16 years saying that the Democratic Party doesn't matter. Israel should be a wedge issue for Republicans, and American Jews don't matter. They're all just going to intermarry. So let's bet on evangelicals.
Yeah.
Lo and behold, 15 years later, we're in this incredibly ironic situation where we have a Democratic president and a Democratic majority in the Senate. This deal can only get Senate ratification under a Democratic president. Because I don't have to tell you where the base of the party, of the Republican Party, of the Democratic Party is when it comes to MBS and Bibi Netanyahu. It would be a real competition for who is least popular among the base of the Democratic Party. My money would be on Netanyahu, but that may be just
they know him better.
Exactly. So it is so ironic that Netanyahu, after dumping on Democrats for 15 years, now can only get this historic deal through if a Democratic president and Democratic senators overcome the resistance, which will be substantial, of the Democratic base of the party and push this through. So that's the rough outlines of how it happened, and I'm obviously supporting it in its own terms, and for me it'll be determined by what are those terms. Right. But I have a secondary or parallel objective of wanting to see this move ahead because I think it could fracture Netanyahu's coalition. Does that make me a bad person?
No, it makes you a very constructive voice, frankly, because I share your view that this current Israeli government is extreme and is bad for pretty much everybody except the settler and annexationist movements in Israel. But I want to note something that I probably should have said in the introduction, which is that people ought to take your column very seriously, in part because you have a history of being a conduit of ideas that materialize. And you mentioned the Arab Peace Initiative. It's probably the most salient example. It's not the only one, where an idea originating from policymakers and decision makers in various capitals was floated in one of your columns and eventually became a real thing. And yes, the Arab Peace Initiative was not ever implemented, but I don't think anybody ever thought it would be. That was not the point. The point of it was, to create a dialogue. It certainly set the stage for the Abraham Accords, which in some ways upend the logic of the Arab Peace Initiative by reversing the chronology of the normalization and addressing the occupation. But at the same time, it's without that, it would have been harder for the UAE to explain to an Arab audience why they were doing what they were doing in terms of annexation and whatnot. So
your audience may be interested that you raised. I don't mean to interrupt, but
no, please.
For me to retell actually the story of how the Arab Peace Initiative happened, or how the Saudi Peace Initiative happened and then became the Arab Peace Initiative.
That would be great.
So it was right after 9/11. I wrote a intense, searing set of columns, very critical of Saudi Arabia, obviously because of 9/11. And but in those days, I used to do columns occasionally of letters from the American president to leaders around the world. I really had Clinton's voice down, and it used to drive people crazy because they never knew if it was really from Clinton or from me or whatever. And sometimes the administration would actually help me with little details. So anyways, then Bush came in, and I couldn't get his voice very well. But I had an idea to try one. It was so after, it was December, I believe, after 9/11, and it may have been January, but whatever. Maybe it was January after 9/11. Davos decided to hold Davos in New York City in honor of 9/11, not in Davos. So I was going, and I decided to try a letter from George W. Bush to the heads of the Arab League, and the letter said, "Hey, we need to reverse this trend in the Middle East now. this is George Bush talking, why don't you guys put down a peace plan of full Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem in return for full normalization. And I should tell you, before I wrote the column, yes, it was in January, I went to Davos and first ran into Andre Azoulay, who was advisor to the King of Morocco, Jewish advisor to the King of Morocco. And I pulled him aside. I said, Andre, I'm thinking of writing this column. What do you think? And he said, put it out, do that. Then I ran into Amr Moussa. I said, I'm thinking of writing this column. What should I do? And he said, put it out. I said, okay, well, that's interesting. Maybe we can change the trajectory of this story. And shortly after, Adel Al-Jubeir, who was then the spokesman of the Saudi embassy in Washington, asked me if I would like to come to Saudi Arabia, because I've been beating them up a lot after 9/11. And I said, okay, yeah, I'd like to do that. So in February of 2002, I go off to Riyadh and I spend a week there. I meet with editors and journalists and students and had some pretty rough conversations, I will say. And after I was there for a week, then Crown Prince Abdullah, who was the effective ruler because his brother was incapacitated, invited me to his horse ranch outside of Riyadh with Adel, obviously, for dinner and a conversation. So went out there, sat in his diwan, those things are, people coming, going, eating, watching TV. And at midnight, he asked me if I would like to retreat to his house. So Adel, I, and Crown Prince Abdullah retreated to his living room. We sat at a little desk. Adel was sort of on one end, the Crown Prince was in the other, and I was in the middle. And we sat down, and the Crown Prince began by saying, Mr. Friedman, you broke into my drawer. He said, Your Highness, what are you talking about? You broke into my drawer. I said, gosh, I don't know what you mean. He said, the peace plan you put out, that was actually my idea. And I said, really? Well, tell me about it. And then we talked about it till 3 a.m. Well, we got done, and I said, at the end of the conversation, I said, Mr. Your Highness, if this is your belief and conviction and proposal, you need to put that out in your voice. And he said, we're actually standing, the three of us. He said, no, you say it. As if it, I said, no, you say it. He said, no, you say it. I said, no, you say it. He said, no, you say it. I said, no, you say it. So we went back and forth with Adel in the middle. And eventually I said, well, what if I write it up as an interview with you, and you check the language that is accurate to what you felt. And if you're comfortable with it, I'll put it out. So I stayed up all night, wrote up the interview, and faxed it to them in the morning. This was there was email, but it was, anyways, I faxed it to them in the morning. An hour later, came back and said, go with it. And it was interesting because I had 2 more interviews. I had one with the Minister of Interior Nayef, the father of Mohammed bin Nayef, and the Information Minister. And in my conversations with them, I realized they didn't know anything about this.
Right. That's Saudi decision making.
Yeah, and on Saturday night, it was coming out as a Sunday column. Adel called me and asked me if I had Ari Fleischer's phone number at the State Department, at the White House. I said, Adel, don't you have an embassy in Washington? And to which he said, well, we're not quite using the embassy on this one. Yeah. And so this was really Crown Prince Abdullah stepping out. So it came out on Sunday. It went all over the place, and then they eventually 3 months later had an Arab summit in Beirut and concretized it. But it remains to this day the only consensus Arab League peace initiative. And
it was also adopted by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So it theoretically 52 countries signed onto it. Now, I mean, some wouldn't live.
Right.
Iran's not going to honor it, but it's went beyond the Arab League even.
Shimon Peres, before he died, called me one day and asked if I would put him in touch with Crown Prince Abdullah, because he wanted to build on this. Unfortunately, the American administration completely dropped the ball. They never picked up on it.
The whole thing was not handled well. It was formally offered on the same day of a major suicide bombing in Jerusalem, and then it really wasn't marketed properly to the Israelis. There were a couple of ads in Hebrew, but there wasn't a full court press on it. The administration here didn't pick up on it, and the Israeli government just blew it off completely and has blown it off completely ever since. So it's a wasted opportunity. The reason I mention it is just to say that you've got a history of floating ideas that are are pretty strongly connected to where diplomatic thinking is going. So let's get into the substance a little bit. You talk about the potential terms, and you've hinted at how you think Saudi Arabia ought to and probably would demand significant concessions from the Israelis on the occupation, not necessarily ending it, because that involves Palestinians and it goes beyond what's achievable, but that they could ask for an end to settlement activity or some kind of commitment on settlements, to expanding parts of or adding parts of Area C, Palestinian populated areas, parts of Area C into Area B, and in other words, giving the Palestinian Authority more control over Palestinians living in the occupied territories. And I think most interestingly, and maybe most difficult to achieve, a promise not to annex additional territories in the occupied territories, specifically in the West Bank. My skepticism about the potential of realizing this deal is more on the Israeli side than on the Saudi or the American side. I think if you could deliver these kind of terms to Washington, you get it, and you could get it through the Senate. I believe this Senate now, I think you wouldn't get more than 10 or 12 votes against it. 15 maximum, that's an overwhelming yes vote. I think in Saudi Arabia, if you presented them with a formal mutual defense treaty, that's just worth its weight in gold. Yes. And I think they'd go for it. The problem is you're asking not just this Israeli government, but this Israel to make some kind of very big concessions on the Palestinian issue, especially regarding settlements and annexation. I get what you're saying about that one of the reasons you're so interested in this is that it would force the dissolution of this cabinet. This cabinet cannot consider such a move, granted. So you're assuming a phone call to Benny Gantz and then a whole series of conversations that lead to a different cabinet, right? Maybe the same prime minister, but a different cabinet. Fine. My problem is that I still can't imagine this Israel, this polity in Israel as it exists now, given the Israeli political system and the structure of the Knesset and how it works and how it empowers smaller parties and whatnot. I just can't imagine them doing it. And I'm wondering what you think about that. Is it, where does it go? And in the course of answering that question, I'd like you to talk also a little bit about how the power grab in Israel and the undermining of Israel's Jewish democracy by the judicial reform and all these other measures that Netanyahu is pushing that really smack of authoritarianism, follow the Orban and even more the Erdogan kind of model of illiberal democracy and majoritarianism and what have you. How that's related to the occupation, because it seems to me there are two different ways of looking at that, right? One is that in some ways, this is the authoritarianism of the occupation that's inherent in military rule coming home to Israel. The idea that you could have a democratic system in Israel living in parallel with a very repressive system in the occupied territories or set of systems, and that would never bleed back into each other is a bit far-fetched over a long period of time. The second thing is that there are people in Israel, proponents of these so-called reforms, of this power grab, who make it clear that the reason they want to get the courts out of the way is because they're looking down the road at annexation. Yeah, there's Netanyahu's legal problems. Yeah, there's Arideri and all these people who want their stuff and they want the court out of the way. But there are people who are looking a little further down the road and thinking that we need to get rid of this court power so that no one can second guess us on annexation. So how does all that work in the context of potentially realizing something like this?
So very good question. They're all interrelated, as you suggested, Hussein. In a previous column or column two, I made the point that what is driving this right-wing government in Israel is a dual dismantlement. They have the agenda of what I call dual dismantlement. They want to dismantle the Supreme Court, and they want to dismantle Oslo. And the two are completely intertwined. To dismantle Oslo, and then their partners among the ultra-Orthodox party who want to dismantle any or neuter any ability of the government to draft their sons into the army, they need to dismantle the Supreme Court. But there's a dual objective here: dismantle Oslo and dismantle the Supreme Court. You need one for the other. So I have a lot of just different reactions to your question. First of all, your skepticism, I totally agree, but I said this to, I think I said it to the New Yorker, that, Hussein, in history, there is sometimes something called the last train. And one reason I'm ready to give this a ride is that I do think, in terms of keeping the hope, I once referred to it as a fiction, only in that it was so desperately unlikely, but to keep any prospect of the two-state solution alive, I think it's in intensive care on life support. This is the last train, and the reason it needs to be considered is that I think to make any real advance now in reviving and driving a two-state solution, you actually have to enlarge the problem. You have to bring in a much larger set of carrots and sticks to bring to bear on Israeli politics. And that's where the US and Saudi normalization deal fits in, which is why I think if you care about this issue of a two-state solution, you have to take it seriously. That doesn't mean you should be in anything other than skeptical that it can come about. But I noticed a lot of the initial reaction, just sort of waving it off. You got a better idea? So, and that's why I've urged, and I got feedback from Palestinians, don't say no, say yes, but, because Netanyahu is just waiting to say, I have no partner.
This is my favorite part of your New Yorker interview. The inability of Palestinians to learn the simple diplomatic art of yes, but is more than frustrating.
And just say yes, but these are our conditions. And I was just tossing stuff out. Again, I would have actually tossed out the Arab Peace Initiative, but I didn't know if that would have seemed too unlikely too soon, for all of this. But I do think it's very important. Palestinians have agency. They have not been heard from in this process, I don't believe. If they believe the term should be the Arab Peace Initiative and not just money, because the Saudis are ready to put bags of money on the table, then I hope they'll say that. I would hope that Palestinians would actually be looking at what's going on in Israel right now, 30 weeks of these kind of protests, and say, I wonder what would happen if we actually every Saturday night, came out peacefully, blocked roads with one hand and carried the Arab Peace Initiative in the other. There's something, going on here that I think is worth observing. So that's why I'm putting it all out. I honestly think, Hussein, this is the last train. I think the train is important because it's one that puts the Palestinian question in a much larger context, takes it out of the narrow Israel-Palestinian equation, where Netanyahu is expert at running circles around the Palestinians. And as an aside, one thing I've also been doing, and I alerted people in the New Yorker article, if you are a journalist, if you are a broadcast journalist, or you are a print journalist, or you're an online journalist, and Bibi Netanyahu is giving you an interview, the first question you need to ask yourself is, what is wrong with me?
Right.
Okay, because Netanyahu only gives interviews to people he thinks he can fool. And again, so he went on George Stephanopoulos.
I was about to say.
And said, Biden has invited me to the White House. Okay, I sat across from the President of the United States, and he said, I've not invited him to the White House. I said, we'll get together sometime in September. John Kirby, the White House spokesman, has reconfirmed that. Netanyahu, nevertheless, goes on Stephanopoulos, says that. And if you don't know the intricacies of this story, it just goes there and goes all over the world. And so he's always looking for out. Then, by the way, what they do is they cut it up into little bites for social networks, and then they put it out. This is a whole program. Now, Hussein, if an Arab American or a Palestinian American went on George Stephanopoulos' show and said a bald-faced lie, okay, what would happen? AIPAC, the Israeli embassy, would be all over Stephan. You got to correct that. It's been 3 days since George Stephanopoulos was told a lie, but that whole dynamic, and Bibi knows this, isn't at work here. And so, there's a few people like me who know actually the internal dynamics of the story, but I'm trying to alert every journalist, if Bibi Netanyahu is giving you an interview, your first question should be, what is wrong with me?
That's a great point. Thank you so much for that. I'd like to throw something else out there before I start bringing in audience questions, which I'm right about to do. But there's one thing that struck me again, and it's really central to this whole idea, which I'm taking very seriously, not only because it comes from you and you have this history of being really plugged into things that actually happen, but also that it would be so much in the interests of all three parties, as you said, and just generally a very good thing to have happen. And I think certainly even in the interests of Palestinians, even if they may not think so. But there is this question that came up in your New Yorker interview, which is, why should the U.S. be interested in a deeper security relationship with Saudi Arabia or even Israel? There's a focus on the human rights record of Saudi Arabia. I'd say there's a problematic Israeli record as well in the occupied territories. But the point is not that. The point is that, I continue to be struck by the extent to which many people outside the administration haven't understood the thinking that has evolved, strategic thinking that has evolved about the Arabian Peninsula since the invasion of Ukraine. I think a lot of strategic thinkers in Washington, especially in the administration, in the context of the Ukraine invasion, pulled out a map of the globe, of the world, and started calculating advantages and disadvantages and challenges. And when you look at it in terms of geopolitics, and I use that term literally, I mean the politics, the strategic value of geography. Right? I don't mean global politics, I mean geographical politics. Right? In terms of geopolitics, probably the biggest single U.S. competitive advantage over great power rivals like China is the security dominance in the three waterways surrounding the Arabian Peninsula and the three great choke points, the Suez Canal, Bab el-Mandeb, and the Strait of Hormuz. The amount of not just energy that comes through those waterways and the Red Sea, the Arabian Sea, and the Persian Gulf, but also through those choke points, and not just energy, commerce that goes through those choke points, and global shipping and whatnot. I mean, this is a competitive advantage that certainly keeps Chinese leaders awake at night. There's not a damn thing they can do about it now. But in the long run, if the United States wants to maintain that advantage, it needs to solidify its maritime alliance with the key players in that area, with Saudi Arabia and its junior partner Bahrain, with UAE and Qatar, certainly with Israel and with Egypt. And if you have all those countries on board, and a major maritime presence in Bahrain and Diego Garcia and whatnot, which is being built up and not drawn down by the administration. I mean, U.S. role in the Middle East is not decreasing. It's actually on an upswing right now for various reasons. That it's sort of obviously a huge strategic interest for the United States, and it doesn't come up much. And I just want to throw that out there. I think it's an overlooked imperative, but the administration knows this, and it helps to guide their interest in this kind of thing.
Well, I'm saying you're raising a very, very important point, and it's just distilled is what's in it for us, and the administration really has yet to make that case, because I don't think they've tied down the terms at all. I noted some of the things they would demand of Saudi Arabia vis-a-vis its relationship with China. And I'm sure that was there partly as to attract Republican votes as well. But the fact is, I don't know myself, and I think they are all still TBD. And because of that, I'm not sure I would support this whole deal. I've just got to wait and see, as we all.
You have to read the fine print, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think it'll be a hard sale. I will say the point I tried to make in the New Yorker interview, and this goes to the fact of maybe one of the most controversial things I've ever written or done regarding the Middle East, was pre the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Really get behind the domestic reforms of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and I make no apologies for that. And the reason I did that, there's a very personal element to this. It's not a personal vis-a-vis me and him. Hussein, I got my graduate degree in Arabic from Oxford in 1978. I got hired on Fleet Street by UPI in 1979. The number 2 man in the Beirut bureau of UPI got shot in the ear by a man robbing a jewelry store on Hamra Street. And they came to me in 1979 and asked me if I would like to be, I was all of 26, would I like to be 25 actually, the New York Times, the UPI reporter in Beirut, middle of the Civil War. I said, this is my big break. I got my little wife from Des Moines, Iowa, and we went off to Beirut. What were the first 2 stories I covered? Big stories. On my Adler typewriter. If you're watching this show and you're a young person, a typewriter was a device where if you pressed a key, it created pressure on a roller. I covered the Iranian Revolution and the takeover of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. Now, everybody knows about the Iranian Revolution. Very few people understood the importance of the Grand Mosque takeover in Mecca. And I try to explain to people by analogy. Imagine that violent Christian radicals took over the Vatican for 30 days, basically. And from the spires of the Vatican, broadcast that the Pope was a drunkard, a gambler, and a woman chaser. That would be pretty shocking. Well, that's what happened in the Muslim world. It was very hard to cover from Beirut, where I was, because the Saudis weren't letting anybody in. But we all know, and I'm not going to go into this any more than I need to, that changed the fundamental. The Saudi reaction to that back then was, well, that's not going to happen again. And they basically took Saudi Arabia, a country where it had women airline attendants before 1979, a country that had women newscasters, women musicians on television. That country put a veil over itself, and it put a veil over the whole Arab Muslim world. And it changed the face, it alone, and in competition with Iran's, who was the authentic sort of Islamic authority, changed the face of the Arab Muslim world, from Morocco to Finsbury Mosque to Jakarta. And it was a giant geopolitical event, but because it happened accretively, it wasn't like a war. People didn't fully see it, and it climaxed in many ways on 9/11. Mohammed bin Salman, what he did to Jamal Khashoggi is not inexcusable. One of the sickest things I've ever seen, actually, as a journalist. But at the same time, he's engaged in probably the most important reform by taking the country of the two holy mosques and reversing 1979. And that is a fundamental U.S. strategic interest. And that's why, as I said in the New Yorker interview, it's been my philosophy, I will never stop talking about Jamal Khashoggi and how awful that was. And
well, he was a friend of mine for 15 years. I literally needed a year of therapy after that.
And a friend of mine too. And I will never stop talking about reversing 1979. And that's what you got to do, And so I think keeping this all in context is just really, really important. And but all that's to say, Hussein, I think it's going to be a very hard sell for the administration. The kind of
Congress.
The kind of issues that you and I follow, and I think it sort of come natural to the way you laid it out. I thought was extremely lucid. If I were the administration, I'd be paying attention to your argument there. I just think in this day and age, between isolationist Republicans and the progressive base of the Democratic Party, that will be a very, very hard sell. But I do think that the strategic transformation of, as I've said to everyone, if you haven't been to Saudi Arabia in the last year, you haven't been to Saudi Arabia. That's how radical the change.
No, it's astonishing, and every time you go back, it just gets more and more striking. It doesn't stop. It hasn't stopped yet. And what really struck me was, when I first was so taken aback, it's not restricted to Riyadh. It's nationwide. It's all over the country, and it's very popular. Yes, there are conservatives, old timers, religious fundamentalists, and various kind of reactionaries who don't like it, but it's extremely popular. There's a youth bubble that feels represented, maybe not by MBS personally, but certainly by these initiatives, and it's very popular. And as a result, he's quite popular. And
they're a vital American strategic interest, because what now is radiating out of Saudi Arabia and its religious establishment and the World Muslim League is just completely different.
Radically different.
Exactly.
It is radically different, and in a really positive way. So that's really true. All right, I want to bring in some questions from our online audience. Please feel free to submit. Yossi Alfer, with great respect to him.
Yossi.
He says Bibi might abandon his current coalition to, offer hollow commitments to the Saudis. He did that a few years ago, no annexation with the UAE, but didn't stop Smotrich and Ben Gvir from gradually annexing the West Bank. What about the Saudi nuclear demands? The Israeli security community is extremely suspicious. The nuclear issue, I think, is overcomable because the Saudis are going to be willing to engage in safeguards. I just should explain to the audience, the what the U.S. demands from its partners who want to engage in civilian nuclear development with U.S. cooperation and with U.S. companies, which is the preferred thing in GCC countries, is a 1, 2, 3 agreement, whereby basically others control the uranium and the rods, except when they're being used to generate energy. And this isn't going to work for Saudi Arabia, because the Saudis uniquely, for a non-nuclear power that is going to get into major nuclear energy development, mine their own uranium. So a 1, 2, 3 agreement would have them basically mine their uranium, export it to be turned into rods, use it, then re-export it. And since you're trying to make money, it just doesn't make sense. So if they're willing to engage in safeguards, then a way can be found to do this. I think the more interesting question, the more challenging question, does come back to Israel and its willingness to discuss, the occupation. And as I say, Yossi raises it, but I'm going to reemphasize it. My skepticism is not just with this coalition, but with the current Israeli body politic as it is today. Is it capable of making concessions to a people who have absolutely no leverage over it? And would it do that for Saudi Arabia and the United States? What do you think?
I think it's an absolutely vital question to ask. I would lean on the skeptical side right now. But I think we can't talk about that, Hussein, without asking where are and might the Palestinian leadership be, especially if there's Abu Mazen will eventually make a transition. What if you do get a Marwan Barghouti? I think one of the byproducts of the Israeli democracy protest movement is that it is revived, kind of center left. I think it also has, if they're paying attention at all, they've come to realize a little bit more what Smotrich and Ben Gvir are up to, what kind of people they're dealing with. But look, I fear it's all too late. You know what I mean? It's too late.
Do you think so? Or do you fear it?
I said I fear it.
Yeah. So I'm trying to clarify that. Do you fear it, or do you think so?
I fear it. I'm not going to say I think it, but I think that I fear it. And so, but I do believe it's so vitally important to these two people, to the region, to the United States in the region, that we just have to keep trying. So, but I do think that again, I come back to the point that Palestinians have agency, and they can shape how this comes about too. And
the problem with Palestinian is, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but the problem, they certainly have agency, and they should and must do and not do a whole bunch of things that frequently they don't. But what they lack right now is the national leadership, right? They have this guy who's happy to be the mayor of Ramallah.
Yeah.
And Hamas, which is not an interlocutor for anybody. So, and they're at odds. So they don't have anyone who is either aspires to be a real national leader or who's capable of doing that. So that's why they have no policy. I mean, that's why the Abraham Accord hit them so hard, because it demonstrated that their quasi-official position that the Arab Peace Initiative was their national strategy was not true and was non-functional, because you don't give your national strategy over to people who have different interests. And that's what it did. And so there was no national strategy. That got exposed, but they're not capable of making another national strategy because they don't have a national leadership. It's disastrous.
I couldn't say it better. And I said it in the piece too, that right now, my goal is just to stop the annexation process until hopefully a transition can be made in the Palestinian Authority and some investment in a credible leadership. Such a parallel, Hussein, in many ways. I mean, Israel, you see this in the demonstrations. They've got this incredible tech elite. There's just a lot of managerial talent there that's come out. And you say, why aren't you people in politics? And I sort of feel the same about Palestinians. I mean, I think they realized that they thought they could have their lives and the system would be kind of okay. They could live with it. And I think they've discovered that unless they get into politics, get their hands on real power, these kind of people are not going to represent their interests. The point I've been making of late is that I've lived in these two countries right next door to each other, Lebanon and Israel. And they have one incredibly similar feature. They are two tiny, tiny countries with radically, radically diverse populations. It's hard to find countries that have more radically diverse populations in one little square footage area and are so small. Yeah. Now, the only way to govern either country is on the principle of live and let live and no victor, no vanquished. And what's basically happened in Lebanon and is happening now in Israel is that in each country, the Hezbollah, the party of God, has kind of stepped in and abandoned no victor, no vanquished, and live and let live for a new principle, one that comes from African dictators. It's our time to eat.
Yeah,
it's our time to eat.
Yeah.
And Ari Shavit pointed this out to me the other day as I was sharing this with him, because the Israeli writer, that the big threat to Israel is not actually that it become Orban's Hungary or it becomes Poland. It's that it become Lebanon.
Yeah.
That once you lose the principle of live and let live, once you lose the principle of no victor, no vanquish, you just start to disintegrate. And I believe that is the real threat to Israel.
Yeah.
And in both cases, you've got the party of God in both countries, driving this.
Yeah, no, I think that's very well stated. Laura Rosen asks why Biden would want to get into such a big agreement with two partners he doesn't trust.
Very good question. And I will tell you, my sense is that Biden is not, I made this really clear in the article because the people I was speaking to made this clear to me. He sent Jake there not to negotiate the deal, but to explore
the
contours of a deal might be, after which he'll sit back and decide whether he wants to proceed with this. So I think it's a very good question. And the thing none of us know, again, is that point, it's the contours of the whole deal. And I think until we really see that, particularly the question of what is in it for America. Your description of it, Hussein, was fantastic, but whether that will be theirs, I don't know. But that's really the question.
Yeah, no, I think that's very fair. All right, so Emil Paulson asks, what would be the Biden administration's main bargaining chip with Riyadh? Security guarantees, he says. I tend to agree with that. I think that's the big kahuna and the big enchilada. But
we don't give out mutual, defense treaties to many countries.
It's very unusual.
So that would be that's a big attraction.
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt. All right, so Stephen Callan asks, what about weapons sales to Saudi Arabia? Are they concerned that a last-minute deal before a new administration could be reversed the way the Emiratis haven't gotten their F-35s? It's a good question, I think.
Yeah, I was saying that's beyond my skill set. I just don't know, but it's certainly part of the deal that would be an attraction to Saudi Arabia, access to the most advanced American weapon systems.
Right. Aziz Al-Hashian from Saudi Arabia writes in that if there's no Palestinian state and more conflict on the horizon, in spite of such an agreement, what are the implications for Jordan, which would affect also the Saudi northern border and maybe Neom? And it's, so very interesting. Jordan is often overlooked in all of this, but it's really important.
Aziz, that's such a good question. And it gets back to one of the columns I wrote, which is that this Israeli legal reform, this legal putsch, isn't just a values question for America. It's a strategic question for America. Because if the far right, and it's hard for Americans to fully understand, I've told my Jewish brothers and sisters, you didn't go to summer camp with these people. They were not in the Catskills, okay? These are the Jewish equivalent of, these are Jewish supremacists. These are the Jewish Proud Boys. And you have no idea what they are capable of doing. Just read a little Jewish history and why the Second Temple fell, the kind of zealots who brought it down, and you'll understand who you're dealing with here. Now, that actually becomes an American strategic interest, because if they push Palestinians out of the West Bank, we know where a lot of them are going to be pushed to, and that is Jordan. And you destabilize Jordan, you destabilize the most important buffer state in the region. I mean, Jordan, we don't fully appreciate what it's done. It's absorbed refugees from Syria, from Iraq, from Palestine, from everywhere, and it's been an incredible buffer state. It's easy to make fun of, King Abdullah, this or that. He's actually, what he's kind of kept together has been a huge, vital American.
I think Jordan is like a giant roll of duct tape holding a lot of the Middle East that is together.
I think of it as a big pillow absorbing all of these things, but
another good analogy.
Because if the feathers all fly out, boy, you have a totally different region.
I mean, it is really crucial that everybody support Jordan continuing to do what Jordan does. And so if you said, what does Jordan do? That's a whole other hour.
And with all, it's got plenty of issues, but it's an island of decency,
Yeah.
And
Nizar Hilal I certainly agree with that. Nizar Halal says, following the coup in Niger and the conflict in Sudan, what about Russia's involvement in the geopolitics of the Middle East, the Gulf, the Horn of Africa, et cetera, and Russia's role in all of this, in this potential conversation?
Nizar, I haven't thought it through enough to give you any intelligent answer, but I got to think about that. But I just don't know right now.
No, fair enough. All right. Well, look, you've been extremely generous with your time so far. We're at the hour mark, and we could go on indefinitely, but I'm not going to keep you. I'm just wondering if you have any final thoughts for us today.
Yeah, my thoughts, Hussein, you probably heard me say this before, but I'm just really writing about three things right now: Israel, Ukraine, and Trump. Because my view is if Israel goes autocratic, if Ukraine goes Putin, and Donald Trump is reelected president of the United States, the world I want to leave to my little new grandson ain't going to be here. There's zero chance. So there's a lot of things I could write about, but I'm focused on these three because I think they are decisive. And they're all too up in the air.
Yeah, that I couldn't agree with you more. They are sort of the three biggest questions out there right now. With the caveat that I see the occupation as inherently built into the Israeli.
That's part of. I said when I say Israel, I'm talking about the
whole thing.
The dismantling, the dismantling of the court, and dismantling of Oslo.
Exactly.
Both of those happen, and you end up with that kind of zealous, whatever the right word is,
zealotry.
The whole region will implode.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
So it's all connected to that fuse.
So it must be avoided. Yeah. All these three things must be avoided. Well, listen, Tom, thank you so much. You've been so generous with your time. I know we've had a very big audience with probably mostly from the Middle East, and it's great to have you talking to them. Thank you for answering all of our questions. I really appreciate it. And, see everybody next time. We'll be doing many more great AGSIW webinars. So have everybody, I wish everyone the best of luck until then. Thank you, Tom.